Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bassam Haddad. I am joined here by Sinan Antoon, whom I'll introduce in just a couple of minutes. We have we have feedback. 1 second. One moment.
You want me to mute?
No, you're good. No, we're good. Okay. Apologies, everybody. So, and also apologies for the delay. We had some technical difficulties figuring out the PowerPoint issue, which is always a glitch. I would like to share that we are very excited here at the Middle East and Islamic Studies program, as well as the co-sponsors, which I will address, to host the one and only, I might say, Sinan Antoon. I am biased. I have known Sinan for some 30 years and have been very fortunate to be around Sinan and working with Sinan and producing films together, producing scholarship, and working on major projects like Jadaliya and otherwise. Before I introduce Sinan specifically, his bio, I would like to welcome you, Sinan. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Yeah, Hella, thank you so much, Habibi. It's so wonderful to, and so odd also to be in a formal setting after 30 years of informality. But thank you so much for hosting me and for your patience. And yeah, I'm so happy and so delighted. I wish it were in person, but this will do for now.
Well,
But
we
I'm
are the
looking forward.
Habibi. We are the big winners here. I cannot say enough about Sinan's work and accomplishments, and his reputation precedes him, of course. But I am obligated to share his bio. This, by the way, is an event by the Middle East and Islamic Studies program. It is co-sponsored by the Shar School, by GLOA, by the History Department at George Mason University, and by the Arab Studies Institute, as well as the Center for Global Islamic Studies. And we are very excited to host Sinan to discuss writing Iraq. And I'll share a little bit about Sinan from his bio. I'll be somewhat selective. Sinan was born in Baghdad in 1967. He left Iraq after the 1991 Gulf War. He holds degrees from Baghdad, Georgetown, and Harvard, where he earned his doctorate in Arabic literature. He is a poet, novelist, scholar, and translator. He has published two collections of poetry and four novels. His works have been translated to numerous languages. His translation of Mahmoud Darwish's last prose book, In the Presence of Absence, won the 2012 American Literary Translators Award. His other translations include The Book of Disappearance by Ibtisam Hazim, who is a fantastic writer that we will host sometime soon. His scholarly works include The Poetics of the Obscene in Pre-Modern Arabic Poetry, Ibn al-Hajjaj, and Sukhf, and articles on Sadi Yusuf, Sargon Bolos, and modern Iraqi culture. His essays have appeared in The Guardian, Washington Post, The Nation, and the New York Times, and many pan Arab newspapers and journals. His most recent work is the Book of Collateral Damage. He is Associate Professor of Arabic Literature at New York University and will probably be joining us again at George Mason to address various students from the Middle East and Islamic Studies program as well as the Shar School on Monday, but we will let you know about this. Sinan, I am very glad you are joining us. I know you are extremely busy. You're always writing either essays or novels or your upcoming books. So thank you for joining us. And please let me know if there is anything that you would like us to start with. I have a very long list of questions and I am happy to have you take the lead. Would you like to start out and then I could ask the questions,
Yeah,
and later perhaps we could have people address questions on Facebook, either the Jadaliya Facebook page or the Middle East and Islamic Studies Facebook page, and I will connect Sinan so that we can answer these questions.
Thank you so much, Bassam. It's really wonderful, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to kind of pause and look back and take stock of my own writing and just try to reflect on it. So I just want to start by saying a few things about the four novels and the few poetry books that I've written, and in a way the context in which they were written, their seeds, their genealogy, in a way, and then we can get to the questions. So, and I worked hard on on the slides. So I'll just start chronologically, even though I don't do that in my novels. I'll try to escape that, but to start talking about how I came to writing briefly and the first work, which is Jam. So I'll just read a few remarks for 20 25 minutes, and then we'll move to the discussion.
And the slides.
So yes, why not?
So
Slides are better than us.
would you like me to start with the slides or?
Yeah, we can start with the Ajam.
Okay.
So um, writing is a subjective act. Literary texts are born in solitude, but they always spring from and eventually pour into a shared and collective space of reading, where the individual is in confluence with the collective, irrespective of the author's desires or intentions. Um, Once a text is published and read by others, it becomes a public act with consequences. It narrates a world and implots histories and will inscribe meanings that will be in conversation with other narratives, echoing, questioning, disturbing, and contesting them. Divorcing a text from its political context is itself a political act. I jokingly and sometimes seriously always say that there are very few advantages to spending one's formative years under a totalitarian system. There is only perhaps one from my experience, and that is having an intuitive understanding of the power of words. Can we change slide, please? Write without hesitation or fear that the state might be dissatisfied with what you write. These words, uttered by the father leader himself in a meeting with the Union of Iraqi Journalists, were often printed in a box on the upper right hand corner of the official daily newspapers in Iraq, Al Thawra or Al Jumhuriyah. By the way, it so happens that today is Saddam Hussein's birthday. This wasn't planned. I imagined these words themselves to be monitoring all other words and texts from that tiny window, which seemed to function as a surveillance camera or a panopticon. I instinctively chose this quote as an epigraph for my first novel, I'jam, whose very title encapsulates a number of ideas about the potential or impossibility of monopolizing and controlling meaning and reading. The main axis of the work was, for me at least, power and the potential for resisting it. Its immediate context was the Ba'athist dictatorship in Iraq, which I lived under, as Bassam mentioned, for the first 2 decades of my life before leaving after the 91 Gulf War. That state's power in terms of controlling its citizens had reached its apex. The war with Iran, which lasted from 1980 till 1988, injected even more power, discursively and otherwise, and was exploited by the regime to delegitimize and silence any opposing voices or views. In the cultural arena, all talents and efforts were oriented towards mobilization. One had to celebrate the permanent victory against the enemy and glorify the leader, or at least make such gestures occasionally. I included an actual encounter I had in the novel that illustrates the situation. Back in college, I was encouraged by a classmate to go along with him to the office of the literary editor of one of the cultural outlets to submit my poems in person. This was in the pre digital era, for those of you who never lived it. I was told that I was talented, quote, and the texts were beautiful, but they could not be published because they were depressing and not mobilizational. One of them was about a mother whose son returns from the battlefront in a coffin. I preferred staying unpublished and not being part of the culture of young emerging writers. I was only able to publish a few years later in Al-Yawm Al-Sabi', a Paris-based journal founded by Arab intellectuals and writers in the diaspora, which was progressive and opened doors to new voices. This, of course, caused a deep bitterness. Many Iraqis, many Iraqi and Arab intellectuals were seduced by the material rewards of singing the praises of the war and its leader. It was instructive in a way, in a very visceral way, and prior to reading any theoretical writings about culture and power or intellectuals and regimes, it was instructive to see writers of great stature come to Baghdad year after year to participate in the annual Mirbet Festival and appear on TV to praise the great leader and his support of culture. I should say that many American and European scholars and intellectuals also came to these festivals, and some of them came back again. There were, of course, those who preferred silence instead of writing, what came to be known as Adab al-Ma'raka and Adab al-Harb, battle literature and war literature. There were many who denounced this and wrote against the grain, who had been exiled or fled the country, and their writing would reach us eventually. One major influence is the great poet Muzaffar al-Nawab, whose poetry and political history of resistance were quite influential and inspirational for so many of us. Nowadays, the brutality of the Ba'athist regime is well known, but it's worth remembering that it was not so in the 1980s. I was haunted by the necessity and urgency of narrating the plight of a citizen who lived in that gigantic prison and who perhaps disappeared and died in one of its many corners. Now that I look back, I understand that unconsciously I was trying to write a novel that grapples with political and social power in all of its daily gestures and mechanisms. A power that not only shackles humans with chains and laws, but pierces through their unconscious, through its discursive mechanisms and its institutions, and most importantly, through language, which is expropriated. Despite the brutality and pain of existence, one is always in search of an exit or fantasizes about one. One tries to shake the bars of the prison, visible and invisible bars, and to dodge and outsmart power, surveillance, and censorship in the hope of achieving minor victories here and there. If we could change the slide. The narrator of my first novel, this is the cover of the Persian translation, and then the next slide is actually, well, that's also, sorry, I'm proud of this because this is the cover of I'jam, of the new edition, which I designed myself. The narrator of my first novel was a young university student who finds himself inside one of the cells of the Amn al-Amma, General Security, for an unknown reason. He might have tried to mimic the leader's regional non-Baghdadi dialect, cracked a joke about him, or parodied one of the many patriotic war songs. When he is given paper by a sympathetic jailer to write inside his cell, he is reluctant at first, fearing that this is just another snare to extract even more information from him. But he comes up with the solution of writing without dots, and thus shielding himself from potential censors. Writing without dots, the way manuscripts used to be written in pre-modern times early on, gives him free rein to play with words and their meanings and to parody the official discourse of the party and the state. Writing allows him to resist forgetfulness and erasure, as if writing on the walls of a cave. He reconnects the bonds that link him to his own past and to the world outside the prison walls. He tries to reconstruct his own memory and to resist the madness caused by physical and psychological torture. There is, of course, always the danger and the tendency to idealize resistance and oversimplify the struggle against power. I chose not to have any closure to the novel, nor a comforting, triumphant ending to the narrative. The manuscript is found as the prison moves, to a new, bigger complex. which is something that actually happened in Baghdad. The larger frame of the novel and the manuscript is the state's attempt to fully explain and ascertain the meaning of what the prisoner wrote, to make full sense of his nightmares and hallucinations, and to find out the identity of one of those who resisted the state's monopoly of meaning and tried to exorcise the internal censor that was implanted in his unconscious before he was thrown into prison. Does he succeed? At least he left behind etchings on the walls of the prison. The novel was published in late 2002 in Beirut, the year before the 2003 US invasion and military occupation of Iraq, which ended the reign of the regime but brought about even more destruction and devastation. The next slide shows actually how I wrote the novel myself. I tried to mimic how the prisoner would be writing it without dots and so on and so forth. Bassam, if you could move to the next slide. Um, the other one, yes. Uh, Dictatorship and its brutal wars, which destroyed the social fabric and infrastructure, were coupled and compounded by a regime of barbaric sanctions that was the most lethal and destructive in modern times. What was not destroyed by bombing was destroyed by those sanctions. Joy Gordon, the American scholar, called it a silent war. 1 million were killed, and 3 million left Iraq to the diaspora. This last war of 2003 and the occupation that went on for 8 years was the final act, to my mind, in a tragedy whose details many of you know. The Iraqi state was dismantled and its institutions destroyed, and a new sectarian militia system was put in place, turning a society already heavily militarized by dictatorship and wars into a chaotic war zone for sectarian parties, most of which returned to Iraq in 2003. The invasion and occupation gave rise to or emboldened ethno-sectarian identities and imbued them with new political meanings and established discursive and actual categories for them. Many, if not most, Iraqi writers and intellectuals, as well as many Iraqis, internalized this sectarian discourse unconsciously or exploited it cynically. A new amnesia reigned and still reigns as to an era or a history where sect and ethnicity were not the primary or defining categories through which life and history were understood and experienced. I mention this because it's an important challenge for writing about Iraq in such an exceptional age. Yes, this slide shows you I wrote the novel Ijam on index cards, trying to mimic the way it would have been written by someone and then the way it would have been scrutinized by one of the officers in the security prison. In addition to the massive rewriting of history under the Ba'ath regime, which is a well-known campaign, Iraq's history and collective memory, like Iraq's museums, libraries, and archives, were looted and disfigured during the invasion and occupation. And then they would be looted again after ISIS by institutions such as the New York Times. All of this raises the stakes of cultural production and the urgency of reconstructing collective memory and documenting and archiving what Iraqis have gone through. Equally important, in my view, is the need to resist collective amnesia and the dominance of sectarian discourses on the one hand, as well as liberal pro-American ones, which prevailed after 2003 and still prevail amongst many sectors of Iraqi elites. I certainly don't mean to suggest that writers and artists should become scribes or political robots, but there is for sure a political responsibility inherent in writing and in cultural production, particularly in this context. It is still difficult to overestimate the tragic effects of the invasion and military occupation of Iraq, which ended in December 2011. The human toll and the magnitude of material destruction visited and unleashed by the occupation is difficult, if not impossible, to measure. for various reasons, but even the most conservative estimates are quite horrific. In addition to the hundreds and thousands of lives lost, there are, according to many studies, still millions of refugees. Of course, all of this was compounded by ISIS, and internally displaced refugees still have yet to return to their homes. Death and destruction was a daily reality for many years, and it haunted and haunts individual and collective memory. How and where would one begin in the face of all of this? That is, if one succeeds in defeating the silence and paralysis. How to still believe in the efficacy of writing and escape nihilism. The situation is, of course, further complicated when one writes about a society one no longer lives in, but observes from a distance while living on another continent and living a daily life radically different and antithetical to the one he or she wants to write. Fortunately, we live in the digital age, and one's memory and imagination are armed with the means to live elsewhere, to inhabit other lives and spaces, and to commute almost on a daily basis via audiovisual and electronic means. Many of us, even if we don't write, live in at least two cities, two countries, if not more. I happened to be reading the newspaper one morning in 2005 when I found a story about a young Iraqi man in his early 30s who had inherited his family's profession of corpse washing. If we could move to the forward to a couple of slides to the New York Times slide. He used to wash and shroud one or two corpses a week in the times of Saddam's dictatorship, but after the US invasion and occupation and the sectarian war, the numbers of corpses quadrupled, and he was making more money than he had ever done so before, but the psychological effects of confronting death every day had taken a toll on him. He was no longer able to eat together with his family and had decided to leave the country and abandon this profession so that his son would not inherit it. As I was reading this harrowing story, I knew right away that I would write a novel about a character like this. I was haunted by his story and became obsessed with it even more after reading about the history of the rituals of corpse washing in the Islamic tradition. Looking back, perhaps the story and the character are so compelling and powerful because they crystallize a number of interconnected themes, local and global. There is the perennial struggle with mortality, which is perhaps the most enduring and universal theme of all. More particularly, the profession of corpse washing and the Mghaysil is one of the few sites where the full extent of the tragedy in Iraq and its consequences can be witnessed. And I, through the corpse washer, was counting the dead, who are uncounted and often nameless and faceless. The protagonist and the narrator in my novel was a young boy who is born into a family of corpse washer, but shows artistic tendencies and rebels against his father's desire for him to carry on the family tradition and profession. He studies to become a sculptor, but the country's economic conditions during the 90s force him to paint houses. After the 2003 invasion and the death of his father, he tragically is forced to go back to the very same profession he had struggled so hard to escape. If we can move forward with the slides. Uh, of course, I had to do a lot of research into the rituals and the history of this profession. I often am asked by certain readers in Iraq, which is quite rewarding, if I had ever myself done that job. And of course, I never did. But I had to read about it and imagine that I did in order to inhabit the character of Jawad. The descent into the underworld of Iraq takes us to the subject of sectarianism and the civil war, which I mentioned. The body, living or dead, is governed by its communal bonds and the power of institutions and discourses that are inscribed on it. The events of the novel underscores that even when the dead Even when dead and stripped of all covers, the body remains an arena for collective memory and an extension of an entire community. The problem of sectarianism, alas, was and still is important and urgent beyond Iraq and is quite evident in neighboring countries in the region. There was, and I think still is a reluctance on the part of some writers, in their work at least, to recognize its existence and importance in their societies. Not that we should reinforce and overemphasize it, but it is foolish, if not disingenuous and irresponsible, to ignore it and write about our societies as if it does not exist. The lethal effects of sectarianism and of the sectarian civil war in Iraq, which raged in 2006 and 2007, extended beyond the lives it claimed and the houses of worship to collective memory itself. The younger generation of Iraqi Christians, who had only witnessed sanctions, invasion, and war, and who came of age at the height of militia culture in post 2003 Iraq, internalized and accepted the sectarian quota system and the sectarian narrative of Iraq's history, disseminated in newspapers and satellite channels. The response on the part of most was an equally sectarian narrative, defensive sectarian narrative of collective history, projecting current and recent problems and traumas back into the distant past, and producing a monolithic and trans-historical narrative of continuous suffering. Next slide, please, Habibi. The attack on Sayyidat al-Najat Church, Our Lady of Deliverance, in Al-Karada district in Baghdad on October. These are the covers of the various translations of Wahda Shajarat Rumman, the pomegranate alone, whose English title is The Corpse Washer, but translations in other languages remained faithful to the original title. That's a subject we can discuss later. And this is the cover of Ya Maryam. Also in English, it became the Baghdad Eucharist, but in French, it remained Ave Maria. The attack on Sayyidat al-Najat, Lady of Deliverance Church in Al-Karada district in Baghdad on October 31st, 2010, was not the first on churches in Iraq in the last 2 decades, but it was certainly, until then, the most lethal in terms of casualties, let alone its deleterious effects on Iraq's already damaged social space. It left 58 corpses. The event epitomized the tragedy of Iraq's Christians and the fragility of their situation, not unlike other minorities as well. Since 2004, more than 60 churches had been attacked all over Iraq, and 2,000 Christians were murdered and 500,000 had fled the country. All of this before ISIS. This event compelled me to change the trajectory of a novel I had been writing and construct a narrative that intersects with the actual event and highlights the divisions and fissures amongst Iraqi Christians themselves, especially in how they view the past and their place in Iraq as a minority. The events take place in 24 hours, but the two main characters inhabit different pasts and different presents, and their memories and contrasting takes on the past form the bulk of the novel. If you can, next slide, Bassam, is the covers of the English and the French translation. There is also a translation in Persian that came out a few years ago, and I am particularly delighted about translations into Persian and Turkish and languages adjacent and languages in our region. If Ya Maryam involved the events of one day, my last published novel started out as the history of 1 minute. But a minute, of course, envelops intertwined lives and deaths. I have been interested for a very long time in the concept of collateral damage, the way in which countless lives are erased or consigned under an abstract category that rationalizes their death and destruction. Actually, I lived and survived the 1991 war, which is almost forgotten, the massive 43-day bombing by the US of Iraq in order supposedly to only liberate Kuwait. That was a very destructive war campaign that cost Iraq heavily. And at the time, of course, like all Iraqis, we were deprived of electricity and water, and our only um, connection to the outside world was the radio. But after leaving Iraq and coming to the United States, I watched the footage of the bombing, and that was the first TV war in a way. It was all on CNN. And then this, since then, and after that, I kept thinking of how horrendous this concept of collateral damage is, and how basically how the world saw the war by and large from the perspective of the bombers and embedded journalism, and how the plight and the experience of Iraqi civilians was completely erased. And this only intensified, of course, after the 2003 and the destruction it brought. So the nucleus of the novel was, the history of 1 minute, 60 seconds, and all that is destroyed in that 1 minute. But then, as I sat on that idea, it developed into a manuscript that is written by a bookseller in Baghdad, who is himself, in a way, a victim of collateral damage and of trauma from a previous war. He is haunted by the desire to take stock of all that is destroyed by war. Not only human lives and sentient beings, flora, fauna, but even objects. He wants to catalog all the destroyed lives and objects, but of course he runs into logistical and psychological problems and obstacles and is traumatized by the impossibility of the task. An Iraqi from the diaspora who happens to be visiting Baghdad together with an American crew making a documentary about the effects of the war. And here I have to say, of course, that Bassam and myself, together with our colleagues in a collective, we actually went to Baghdad in July and worked on About Baghdad, a documentary, one of the few documentaries until today made outside of Iraq that highlight the perspectives and focus on Iraqi civilians and what they had to go through. So it's not an autobiographical novel, but of course it's informed by my own experience. The bookseller meets the Iraqi visitor and tells him about this project of collateral damage, and then they continue to correspond through another dimension in the novel is how one writes about a country being destroyed, living in it, and how one observes it from afar while living in the country that is carrying out the destruction. And there are other questions about how one is able to write the history of the vanquished and to save their voices, and so on and so forth. Also, it was quite experimental in that it was consciously in conversation with genres in the Arabo-Islamic tradition, with the Conference of the Birds of Fariduddin al-Attar, and primarily with a book by Ibn al-Nadim, which is called Al-Fihris. So the original title in Arabic is Fihris, which is very difficult to translate into one word in English. So that's why the English translation is the book of collateral damage. If we can move to the next slide. These are some of the epigraphs that I put in the beginning of the novel that speak to kind of the frame through which I wanted to write the novel. And as you can see, it's also about the impossibility of the task that haunts the narrator. So there is a quote from Ibn al-Nadim from his Al-Fihris, which was a book to catalog all the books in existence at the time in Baghdad. He left many blank pages in it. And then a quote from Al-Jahid about books and writing, which speaks to our subject today, how the books speak for the dead and translate the speech of the living. And then, of course, Walter Benjamin and his thesis on the philosophy of history is a very strong influence on the novel, and there are many quotes interspersed here and there, especially that Wadud, the character in Baghdad, is an obsessed book collector. Um, and of course, the inescapable Borges about memory. We are our memory, we are that chimerical museum of shifting shapes, that pile of broken mirrors. So, enough about my novels, and then we'll move to poetry, which I won't say much about, just to say that if we go to the next slide, I so far have two collections of poetry in Arabic, published in 2010 and 2018. The first one, ليل واحد في كل المدن, kind of collects the poetry that I had written in the 10 years before, One Night in All Cities, and the latest collection, كما في السماء, as it is in heaven, about the poetry written in the latter period. And I'm almost finished with the third collection that will hopefully come out at the end of the year, also from Manshurat Al Jamal. The next slide is in English. I have published one collection called the Baghdad Blues, which collects some of my early poetry, thanks to my friend Peter Money of Harbor Mountain Press in Vermont for encouraging me and for hosting the book. Next slide is to moving from poetry to another adjacent praxis that's very important, which is translation. And the Peter Money and I, Peter Money is a great American poet, I befriended when living in New Hampshire. He lived in neighboring Vermont when I taught at Dartmouth. We were both friends of Sadi Yusuf, the great Iraqi poet, and we collaborated on translating 50 of his poems, particularly poems written before and after the 2003 invasion and occupation. It came out of Grey Wolf. The next slide shows the cover of my translation of Mahmoud Darwish, one of my favorite books, In the Presence of Absence, his last quote-unquote prose book, but it's not really prose. It's a kind of a self-eulogy and an autobiography. It's a wonderful book that I'm so proud and happy to have translated. And I should say the picture on the cover is from the destroyed village which Mahmoud Darwish was born in and lived the first years of his life before being depopulated and raised by Zionist forces. That's one of the trees that are mentioned in the book that overlooks the cemetery. The next book that I translated, if we could move, is a wonderful novel by Ibtisam Azam, The Book of Disappearance, which has a fantastic premise. What happens if the Israelis wake up one day and find that all Palestinians have disappeared? But the novel is also about collective memory and about the memory of the colonized and how they resist erasure and so on and so forth. I highly recommend it, of course. Otherwise, I would not have translated it. I also translate a lot of individual poems into Arabic from English, many poems by Charles Simic and Merwin and others. And the next slide shows my recent translation of a Borges autobiographical notes. It's a long piece that he published in the New Yorker in the early 70s, which speaks about his childhood and early influences and his relationship to language and writing, which was published a few years ago by my publisher Al Jamal. So much so for translation, which continues. The next slide shows my other interest, of course, is what I was trained in Arabic and Islamic studies, primarily Arabic literature. if you know, my first novel was about someone who was imprisoned, and I translate exiled and displaced poets. During my years in graduate school, I came upon this amazing poet from Baghdad who had been disappeared, from literary history. He was quite famous. He popularized and invented a new genre of poetry, sukhf, obscene and scatological parody, and was famous all the way in Al Andalus and Egypt, and was admired and emulated in later periods, and even respected by peers and critics. But in the early modern period, he begins to disappear from literary history. Most of the Orientalists who wrote about Arabic poetry left him out for reasons you can guess, and a lot of great majority of Arab critics also mimicked that. There are very few who mentioned him, and I chose his poetry as the topic of my dissertation because I thought it was really important as part of revising and changing the literary and cultural history we inherited, and also him being from Baghdad, and also his poetry giving a wonderful view of the complexity and the richness of popular culture in Baghdad. Next slide. Um, I think we go forward somehow, if there are slides. Yes. Well, whether in translation into English or also a number of my academic essays have been about Sargon Bolus. Sorry for the parenthesis is not closed. Maybe this says how the poet lives on. Sargon Bolus is a
أنا أنا
very,
أنا أنا بسكر لك إياها.
thank you so much. Very important poet in modern Arabic poetry, very important poet for a lot of young poets, but also very important in Iraqi poetry and the history of the prose poem. But for me, for personal reasons, I've been fascinated by Sargon Bolus because of his how unique he is. Someone who leaves Iraq and goes to Beirut, and then comes to the United States in 1967 and lives in California for a very long time, but continues to write in Arabic. And particularly how his poetry changes, but also how he addresses many of the themes that I'm forced to contend with, and many Iraqis and others. What does it mean when you live in a country that is bombing and destroying your homeland, your country of origin? And I've translated many of his poems, and I continue to work on, hopefully soon, next year that I have a sabbatical, will finish a huge collection of his poetry, spanning his entire career, to be translated into English. The next, I guess I would like to end um, just by reading a few of my own translations of my poems, and then we can move to questions and answers. So, or maybe I read this one in Arabic, and they can read it, right? It's big enough for
Yes.
them to read, Bassam. Okay, so Psalm, or in the beginning. في البدء كانت الطعنة، خلق الخنجر الجرح على صورته ثم ابتعد يبحث عن جسد آخر، وبكى الجرح 40 يوما، ثم التأم صار قلبا وزحف يبحث عن جسد آخر. And the next one is called The Day. And then the day came when the earth was spent and overbled and lost its gravity. 3 leaves stopped falling. dead birds too. Their corpses kept flying up into the gray sky, which had become a colossal screen of the underworld. The next one is called الإله الجديد. الإله الجديد. نظرنا إلى الخارطة. كل هذه الأنهار عبرناها بحثا عن الإله الجديد. قال الكهنة إنه ولد من أجلنا، وحين اهتدينا إلى موطنه أبصرنا بشرا مثلنا يشيعونه في مواكب مهيبة. مشينا معهم، حدثونا عن كل تلك الأنهار التي عبروها بحثا عن الإله الجديد الذي قال الكهنة إنه مات من أجلهم. And the next one, I'm reading one in Arabic and one in English for no obvious reason. Another day. The day starts its day with hope, looking into the mirror. It dreams of being different, not just another day, but a day of monumental events that will change the world and rouse humans from their slumber. It makes its way around the earth, and then we see it in its last hours as it returns exhausted, like a shabby, homeless man, blinded by blood. It returns having discovered it's just another day. And the next one is called Phosphorus, and it is about Fallujah in Iraq, where phosphorus was used, white phosphorus. When I was a kid, the tail end of my bike had a red reflector. It glowed in the dark, just like the eyes of a cat, illuminated by headlights of distant cars. Tiny bits of phosphorus. Tiny bits of phosphorus, white phosphorus, illuminated the skies of Fallujah years ago, and now infants there are born with two heads or without eyes. Next, some of the more recent poems. I forgot the names of the gods. I forgot the names of the gods. I doubted the prophet's miracles. The priests cursed me, and my people stoned me. No one prayed over my corpse, but a stray angel perched nearby. Carry me to the other world, I said. I cannot. She cried, wiped off her tears with her wings, and flew away. Next, two scenarios. The lips of the drowned float on the surface of the sea and scream, but the sky has no ears. Hungry crows swoop and carry them ashore to devour them. The second scenario, the lips of the drowned rise to the surface of the sea and scream, but the sky has no ears. When they are tired, they return to what remains of their bodies down below. Finally, one entitled Search. They search my wounds. Where did you hide them? There is no one here. I am all alone here in my body. Next slide. And the next slide will say, thank you so much for your patience. So,
Wow, we all need a break, Sinan. This has been very generous of you. and very illuminating and moving. Thank you so much. I
Thank
am
you, Habibi.
always, I'm always moved by all your work, but certainly the poetry, especially in Arabic. Thank you for being
Thank you.
generous with us and sharing your work for almost an hour. I know that you had to skip many products and details, but it's been really remarkable to hear this
Thank
expanse of productivity and intellectual production. um, I don't know where to start. I mean, let me. I mean, I have some questions. We'll also see if there are questions on Facebook that I will share with you. But let me first start with my own question, which has to do with. I mean, it's a very basic question. I have several, so I'd like to ask you, how does being an academic influence your creative work? Are there any overlaps or intersections, and how do you balance between the two? We've talked about this many times before, and surely academic work is remarkable, and yours as well, of course, but somehow this other sort of work can be a bit closer to the heart sometimes, and of course the mind, but a bit closer to the heart than the academic work. I know from experience. I'm not as artistic as you are, but I know from
لا ولو.
experience, Habibi. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I should confess and say that, when I was younger, well, that's not a confession. When I was younger, I was even more impatient than I am now. And what I mentioned in my remarks in the beginning about not being published in early on in Iraq, when when I was 20 or 21, of course, like any aspiring writer, you want to be recognized, you want to be in conversation with others. And again, before, in the pre-digital age, the only place where one could publish was in paper, in journals. And frankly, not wanting to compromise and participate in this general atmosphere of pro-regime writing and whatnot, I ended up being outside of the so-called generations of writers and outside all of these circles, rightfully so, and thankfully so. One of the few decisions in my life that I'm proud to have. So that engendered a sense of bitterness and urgency that I have to be published. And then coming to the United States in 1991 was disorienting in a way of, again, being away from the language that I love, and my first language. Again, that we're speaking in the pre-digital age, when you really experience what it means to be cut off. But also going into academia, despite it being a privilege, you we are trained in a way to be critics. And I mean, there are writers who succeed in publishing and being productive and writing poetry and novels while they're finishing their masters or PhD. But I had a crisis of sorts, that my creativity was slowing down or even stopping for many years, for a variety of reasons. So I had that compounded my bitterness. But I realized, actually, in the long run, that I benefited a lot from being in academia, because in a way, academia also allows you to read so much and to enrich yourself intellectually, and makes you a better reader, a smarter reader. And to be a better writer, one has to be a better reader. And I'm, lucky that my field of so-called expertise, or my field of study, is not that far away from what I do. So actually, immersing myself in pre-modern Arabic poetry gave me a lot of fuel and enriched the way I view poetry itself, and even informs my writing. So although the idea, for example, of writing without dots was inspired by a friend that I had in high school, who used to sit next to me and who used to always write without dots. And I would try to figure out what he's writing. And I mentioned that in the novel. The narrator says, so and so, my friend. But then, studying manuscripts with my advisor at grad school, who is no longer with us. I learned a lot from him. Wolfhard Heinrichs also inspired me even more to complicate my novel and its setting. And in recent years, I've been able to combine and have an overlap between the poets that I love, for example, Sargon Bolas, Saadi Youssef, Mahmoud Darwish, and others. I translate them, I read their work, and I write about them, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, academia gobbles up so much of your time and your mental space, but one ends up making peace somehow and being smarter about using those intervals when there is a certain freedom and becoming more efficient in managing time or less efficient in wasting time. So overall, I guess maybe because we're getting older, we're trying not to be very bitter, and even though you should get more bitter as you get older. So
Well, it's. I mean, I can vouch in the opposite direction because as time goes by, actually, that's not happening with you. It's the opposite actually. Okay, so one more question before I go to questions on Facebook. Can you share quickly? This is broad, that's why I'm getting to it, and then I have other specific questions about basically the use of spoken dialects in your work. But I'll postpone that until we hear from others. But first, what are the challenges of writing about a country like Iraq that you've left more than 3 decades ago? And I know that you go back and forth, but what are some of the challenges of doing so, and how might you advise others who might be in a similar situation to proceed with the work,
yeah, I
respectively?
mean, I think it is a challenge, obviously, because everything changes so quickly and drastically, especially when there is war and destruction. I mean, language is what we use, and language changes uh, um, so quickly, and all the different registers, especially for someone who's enamored with pop culture and the different registers of language and the dialects. But I think a fear that a lot of writers who are displaced or who live far away from the places they're writing about, the fear that they might have or should have is that their writing then becomes, cut off, or becomes, you use the term touristic and so on and so forth. Because especially if you're writing about an era you yourself lived, that makes it easier. But what if you, especially when you live a radically different everyday life, that's always a challenge. So to be honest, at least my personal experience, one of the most rewarding statements that I hear from readers in Iraq when I visit is that it is as if you never left. And I realize what a privilege it is to be away, and we escaped basically. But writing for me is about inhabiting different characters, other lives, other selves, and about recreating worlds um, that have to be believable and have to be perfect in their internal dynamics. And so it is always rewarding to hear that. But I think it might sound simple, but I always think of passion. If you are an obsession, if you are passionate about a story and about a place and you are obsessed with it, and here we come to academia again, that research, not that you have to be in academia to understand and do research. All writers do research even though they're not in academia. But I think understanding that one has to do the research and collect so much material, that most of which even one might not use. Um, um, so these are the challenges. I think one has to stay in touch with that place by reading about it and by seeing how it changes. And as I said in my remarks, technology nowadays gives us all of these tools that help us to bridge these gaps that existed in the past before the digital age, before um, satellite channels, before social media. It would have been much more difficult to stay in touch and keep abreast of everything. So I don't know if that answered your
Uh,
question.
no, I mean, yeah, I mean, we talked about this before, but I'm glad we addressed it. Thank you. Absolutely. I have a couple more questions, but let's go to a question from Facebook. By the way, if people see that I'm looking down, it's not that I'm depressed. It's that the bigger screen is here in front of me. It's this thing. It's where the Facebook feed and all of the other production material is. So a question from Ruba Al Hassani.
Yes.
How much of a role do you believe novelists and poets can play in the decentralization process in Iraq or anywhere else, but especially Iraq?
Decentralization.
Decentralization. Oh,
Yeah, I
sorry.
mean,
Hang on 1 second. I just adjusted my glasses and I realized that it's not decentralization. But you can answer that one too. It's desectarianization.
yes. I mean, look, I'm of two minds, to be honest with you. On the one hand, obviously, in what I and many of my fellow writers and poets write, we believe, I mean, our own vision and the way we process history and reality is shaped by all the texts that mediate the world for us. So, you know, poets and novelists are not that powerful vis-a-vis satellite channels that have millions of dollars behind them or other platforms. But I should also say that's why I mentioned Mudaffar Nawab, for example, as one example of many that, in my experience, in experience of many of my generation and others, having those voices that go against the grain was very important for us, and it continued to be very important. And I mentioned, for example, I should mention the Safa al-Sarraj, the hero, the martyr of the uprising in Iraq, is one of the most important icons of that uprising. Himself was influenced greatly by Mudaffar al-Nawab and by other poets and writers. So poetry, contrary to what some think, is an important force in shaping how people view the country's history and how they view history in general, and as are novels. But I should say that unfortunately, and I mentioned that in my remarks, there are many novels that reinforce the sectarian discourse and that reproduce the sectarian discourse. Just as that applies to every society where there are many novelists and writers who are reproducing some of the master narratives. So, yeah, I think I'll try. One disadvantage of being an academic is I think we tend to go on and on instead of giving short answers. All right. I can't hear you.
Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
احنا
Oh, and they're
احنا
coming in.
بالخدمة.
They're coming in.
بالخدمة.
All right. A question from Kristen Hilliers. Might be mispronouncing. Uh, Kristen says, "Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. I was wondering if you could speak more on the depiction of violence, more specifically state violence, in your novels." Which I'm assuming this person is saying that she'd like to hear more, not asking you to put more about state violence in your novels because it's replete with these references. But can you speak more about the depiction of violence in your novels?
Violence or state violence?
It says depiction of violence, and I'm assuming, and then they say more specifically state violence.
Well, I mean, I that's why the first novel I wrote, I mean, in my remarks, I focused a lot on language and manuscripts and dots, but but the novel itself touches upon the physical violence, not only verbal violence and discursive violence, but the physical violence and the torture that um, a prisoner undergoes there. And in a way, the second novel, The Corpse Washer, basically the violence was carried out by all of these militias that are part of the state and that are linked to the parties that were occupying the state. I don't know how much more I can say. If I had another way of saying it, I would not use the novel to say it, but I should say that the novel that I'm finishing right now is about two characters who are both victims of state violence. One of them is a victim of the state violence under dictatorship when the those who deserted the army were punished by cutting off their ear, which is something that hundreds of Iraqis suffered from. And the other character is someone who's a victim of the state violence of post 2003. Because one of the other issues that we have now in Iraq and in other places is this problem that occurs in these types of societies that undergo all of these wars and problems is these competition of competing memories and competing traumas and so on and so forth. So I don't know if the um, yeah, I think that's my answer, and I'll stick to it.
طيب Azim. Um, so there's one more, couple more questions. One by our own John Callas. Johnny, you're listening.
Mm.
Maybe he's trying to. Actually, he just got accepted to two remarkable schools with full funding. I don't know if he's gonna kill me for saying this live on the air. Uh, oops. John is like his family.
He's brilliant. He deserves it.
I know he was your student at NYU, right?
He still is.
Right now,
He's trying to get extra credit, but he doesn't need extra
he is
credit.
in this semester. Your student.
Yes, yes.
Oh my God, John, I don't know about that. Let's see if the question is like pandering or trying to do some kissing up. Okay. What can young writers do to remain relatively palatable? Wow. John, I mean, he's trying to impress us. What can young writers do to remain relatively palatable? Which I pronounce it as a Lebanese person, can't pronounce it properly. For contemporary publishers while still pushing against hegemonic narratives of the Middle East and the rest of the global South. He's definitely trying to impress you.
No, that's a question that comes up in class a lot, and I don't know if I have the answer. I think, not that there is anyone who, or there are that many writers who can completely shut off the notion of being published, and of course, because but I think it becomes a problem when the scale goes down in the other direction. Meaning, if one is too worried about satisfying the publishers and the agents, then one is not going to end up writing that novel that transcends all of these. So, as we've seen in general, that uh, commercial markets in the global north tend to favor certain types of narratives. And much of the great fiction from the global south, not all of it, but much of it, is translated and published thanks to small publishers or university publishers or people who are committed to doing that. But the same thing applies actually to filmmaking. There are ways to navigate this minefield and to produce the novel that one wants to write, that does not, subscribe to these recipes that we all know and that does not end up reinforcing. But I think It's also about being cognizant of who is your primary audience. Not that you have to have a primary audience, but that's a complicated issue. I always bring up the example of Toni Morrison writing in this country when she wasn't interested in being palatable to white audiences, and that is what made the difference. In addition to her amazing talent, of course, and her vision, she wasn't interested in pleasing a certain um, population. So there are ways of doing it.
Okay,
palatable حلوة palatable.
I know. So what's the correct pronunciation? I mean, I'm not as bad with comfortable. I can say comfortable, but is it palatable? Palatable.
Palatable.
Palatable. All right. So we'll move to the last question. Oh my God, we have another question. So I hope you don't have to fly somewhere tomorrow because we're going to be here for a while. So there's a question by Furqan Sayyid, spelled
Hmm.
with two E's. So it might be Sayyid, I'm not sure, or Saeed with a Y, I'm not
Right.
sure. It's on Facebook. It says, quote, it says, quote, thank you, Sinan. Question for you. Do you think the looting of a historical archive, particularly in the context of invasion, is different from the loss of archival memory or degradation of historical artifacts through neglect? دبر حالك.
That's a great question, and I don't know if I have a satisfying answer, but I think I know what Furqan is getting at, because the conversations that go on when these issues are brought up, whether if um, artifacts or archives are looted in Iraq or Syria or elsewhere in the global south, many people in the global south say, well, it's tragically, but perhaps they are better off abroad where they'll be safe and sound. But then we tend to forget that how was this situation, and who created this chaos, and how did we reach this position? So I think both are problematic and tragic, whether um, you know people in the country itself don't live under a system or a regime that allows for the voices to, or gives them a chance to participate in the conversation about how to preserve and how to construct an architecture of memory and on their past, because there are no institutions, there are no democratic spaces. That is a problem. But the solution is not for a neo-colonial, neo-imperial looting of everything. I know that this is not what Furqan means, but I think the problem is not to see this as a binary whereby looting and salvage by foreign powers or foreign institutions. And we know the history of these museums, and actually the whole concept of museums, especially in recent years, is under scrutiny. And even the archive, with all of its own exclusions, even within these nation states, of course, and how it reproduces the exclusion of certain nationalist discourse and so on and so forth. So that's a very good question. These questions are too much for me.
Aw,
I'm not that sophisticated.
aw. طيب, before I get to the last question, which is by a friend of ours as well, that's the problem when you know a lot of people.
Is this like a curated thing?
Yeah, yeah, we planted these questions. Um, all right, so my questions, I'll ask them together so that we can move forward and you can have a chance to address both of them, and they're kind of related. The issues of using spoken Arabic, spoken dialects in Arabic novels, which you do, comes up often in debates. You have consistently done that in your work, of course. Can you elaborate on your choices and motivations for that in any way you like? And second, you continue to write novels in Arabic as well as poetry. Why not in English, and other personal or political dimensions to this that you can share with us? So I'll ask them both, and then we'll go to the last question. and then
Sure.
we'll break.
So briefly, I mean, there is a whole myth when it comes to Arabic about the purity of Arabic, and I'll just simply say that if one reads carefully, even pre-Islamic poetry, or goes back, you realize that there are already so many dialects, and that the Fusha and the lingua franca is something artificial. Now, um, it's always politicized, the issue of using the spoken in the dialogue. I don't have time to get into it, but for me, I cherish, and I've always cherished since I was a young kid, the variations in every language, but especially the language that I grew up with, Arabic. Where at home, because my family background is Chaldean, the older generation, my father and my aunts spoke a mixture of Arabic and Neo-Aramaic, and as Christians, we had a certain dialect that we used inside the house, Qalli wa Qaltulu, which is influenced by the Mosul dialect, but outside the house, we spoke the Baghdadi dialect of Gelli and Gilitla. And it's cool. Sorry, there were students who were transferred from the north or from the south who spoke different dialects. And even in Baghdad itself, when you cross the river, there is a difference. And to me, it's ridiculous that I would write a novel where everyone speaks the same way. The different registers of people's social backgrounds, their class background, their regional backgrounds, all of this nuance, all of the texture, or the beauty and the variations all disappear. Plus, and I only recently started to say this, it's as if watching a musalsala on TV where people speak the language they speak, or watching one that's dubbed in Fusha. Why would I want to do that? And some of the writers that I most admire, for example, Ghaib Tama Farman or Samir Naqash, the Iraqi Jewish writer, did that already, and I see no problem in it. The other issue that comes up is mostly from writers. Iraqi writers always say, "Oh, I don't think our Arab brothers and sisters will understand that." But I always get feedback from Arab readers who say that they actually enjoy reading these dialects, just as I enjoy reading the Moroccan dialect when I read a novel. They do so too. But for me, the characters are real, and I write the way they speak and the way I hear them. I can't have them speak Fusha. It just does not make any sense for me. It's for purely aesthetic reasons. In addition to, as I mentioned, every language in the world has dialects. Everywhere you have a language, you have dialects and you have differences. The issue about writing in Arabic comes up. It's the language that I grew up in, and it's the language that is the reservoir of all of my personal memories and my cultural archive, and I enjoy writing in that language. And since up until now and for the foreseeable future, I will always write about um, Iraqis. I can't write about them in English because then I would be translating in a way, right? Um, so that's why I write in Arabic also, because I'm more at home in Arabic, and I tend to be more poetic and to um, and I also miss, I mean, as I said, in coming in 1991, I was cut off from the language. Now it has changed thanks to social media and to satellite channels and whatnot. But I like being in Arabic, and I like thinking in Arabic, and I like writing in Arabic. Perhaps there would be more a shortcut to commercial success in writing in English, and I might write a novel directly in English in the future. But for the time being, I see no reason not to write it in Arabic, because, frankly, I have realized that my primary constituency happens to be in Iraq and in the region and in the diaspora. Not that I'm not happy to have audiences and readers in all of these other languages, of course, the more the merrier, but I feel a certain commitment to readers in Arabic.
Thank you. Thank you, Sinan. Last
And
question.
I just wanna just go back to the notion. It's the dialogue that I write in the spoken. The narration itself, the narrative is of course in the Fusha, which is beautiful and I enjoy it. But the dialogue, the characters when they speak, the spoken of every day, I write it always in that particular spoken dialect. But the narration and the narrative is in Fusha, the modern standard. I'm not in favor necessarily of those who write, or I'm not in favor of writing an entire novel in the spoken.
Thank you. Thanks, Sinan. One question by Leili Kashani, our friend. Hi, Leili. Sinan, and that's I'm quoting. Sinan, it's such a pleasure to listen to you speak about your work and its concerns. Could you speak a little more about the looting of Iraqi cultural heritage by different forces, including, as you said, the New York Times? I think, unfortunately, this history is being erased slash forgotten as part of a larger arc of justifying the US invasion under the frame that, quote, within the quote, well, things are better now than under Saddam, unquote. And the last part of the question is, or the last part of the question, which is after it also, which you critically, she says, which you critically challenge and subvert. Lady, there's a period here which threw me off. I apologize. So basically, you're critical of this position that things are better and that's that, and you subvert that. So can you address these a series of questions? And then we have one short question, and I will end after that because somebody just sent a quick question. But let's do Layli's question first. It's
Yeah,
important.
no, thank you, Leili, so much. I'm really honored. I mean, I wrote about this even a long time ago before the New York Times. I wrote on Jadaliya, an article about plundering the past. And sadly, all of this also started in 1991. And again, I'm not one to exonerate the regime, the Iraqi regime. I wrote my first novel about the horror of that regime. And of course, archaeology and archives are always weaponized by all regimes, including the Iraqi regime. But the reality is, until 1991, the Iraqi state had allocated certain resources to its museums and to protecting archaeological sites. The destruction of 1991 and the sanctions that destroyed the Iraqi economy opened Iraq up to the market of looting. And that's when so many of Iraq's artifacts started to be smuggled outside of the country. I mean, some members of the Iraqi regime itself were implicated and involved in that. But it's about linking Iraq and with the weakening of the state, opening Iraq up to the pillage of all of these things. And when we come to 2003, the story is well known. I mean, that's what we showed about Baghdad, which we worked on together, Bassam, myself, and our friends. In that, of course, you all know the Ministry of Oil was protected, and the Ministry of Interior, I think, but the museum was not protected. And I just read yesterday, because I'm also doing research for a book about all of this, about how in Nasiriyah, in the Nasiriyah Museum, the US made the museum its headquarters. So, and linking, opening up, I mean, sorry to keep quoting myself, but there's always this, liberating and liberating and liberating. What they liberated was the country's wealth in a way, and making it open to being looted by this global network. But already under the aegis of the occupation, Kanan Makkiya took it upon himself to take millions of documents from state archives that belong, and took them to his father's house in the Greens or somewhere else, and then transferred them to um, Stanford University, the what's his name institute, Hoover Institute, right? So that was, and it's under the same discourse in a way about saving and preserving and all of that. And of course, now that archive is only open to well, of course, I mean, it used to be only open to scholars who are in the U.S. or close, but now there is restitution, but there was recently, the scandal of Hobby Lobby and all of that, and even the current Iraqi Ministry of Culture was about to sign a very problematic agreement, which would allow Hobby Lobby to use these stolen artifacts that it had purchased illegally, and so it continues to be a huge and catastrophic problem. And about the better or before or better after, it's sadly that binary that the Bush administration put in place is still operative in a way where people ask, well, wasn't it better before? But of course, it's not that simplistic. But I wrote in one of the articles something that I didn't want to write or never imagined to write, but this is what a lot of Iraqis themselves would tell you today. And that's what a lot of Iraqis told me in my last visit in December, is that I never thought that there could be a situation that would be worse than dictatorship under Saddam. But the United States managed to achieve that. Um, so, I mean, I continue to disrupt that by complicating these narratives through the novels or through the essays or
Yeah, and
and
complicating also the simplicity of the analogy, as though, I mean, these are equal things. There's of course a huge difference. And thank you, Sinan. Okay, so we will conclude, but I'm going to ask you these two quick questions. One by Professor Hiba. I don't know why I said professor. I never really used that. But our colleague at George Mason, Hiba Al-Chazli, she is actually going into a class or something. But she asked me to ask you, why do you translate? Sorry, why do you?
ايوه شو صار.
I think it's miswritten. One second. I think she wants to say, why don't you translate your own work versus having a translator like, say, Jonathan Wright do the translation? So that
No,
that
that's
one.
it. That's
Let me ask
oh
a second question, then we'll close. This way, we will close the questions window. Another is a retort by Ruba. Have you written or used any such material in response, I'm assuming, to John's question in your teaching about Iraqi youth's processing of trauma via poetry? But I'll ask you these last questions and then we will conclude.
yeah. The answer to the second question is no, not yet. I haven't written it. But about translation is a very difficult process. It's really. I mean, I'm not saying this because I'm a literary translator myself, but because I know. And so I appreciate it so much when my works are translated. It's also the material that I happen to write deals with war and violence, and frankly, it's always emotionally taxing when one finishes writing a novel. So many writers write about that. When I the corpse washer, واحدة شجرة الرمان, I was so still living in a way in that novel and its atmosphere and living with its characters even after I finished it, which happens to most writers. And I almost wanted to stay there, but I didn't want. There are all these references to Iraqi popular culture and to certain aspects of Shi'i tradition that, frankly, yani, at the expense of sounding arrogant, I didn't want anyone else to do it because I knew I would do it better. And even if I didn't do it, then I would have to answer so many questions. So I did it. But it was emotionally taxing because translating a text, you even go deeper into every sentence than even the writer did at certain times. So I ended up being in that very same zone, emotional zone of corpses and death and sadness and destruction. And after I finished this Ya Maryam, I was also drained emotionally. So when I get a suggestion or a question from a translator who wants to translate the novel in a moment of weakness, I said, okay, better off if they do it than I do it. So that's the only reason. It's about who asked to translate the novel, and I said yes. But I think from now on, to the detriment of my blood pressure, I will translate the novel that I'm finishing now. Yeah, but it's not premeditated. I twice I happened to have finished the novel, and a translator said, "Do you want me? Do you mind if I translate?" And I said, "Yes." About the issue of the youngsters and poetry, and no, I haven't written anything about it, but that's something to write about in the future. In the there's a book that came out in Arabic about, well, testimonies about this latest uprising, and in my eulogy of Safa Sarai, who was a friend, I wrote about what poetry meant to him, and how I mean, one of his achievements was kind of transformed patriotism into some kind of aesthetic object. And to go back to translation, I should say that as someone who translates myself, know how translation is so underappreciated and translators are so underpaid. So that's why I put the covers of the Persian translations and the other translations. I couldn't put all the covers, but I'm so delighted always when I am translated into another language, because as Benjamin says, this is a whole new afterlife for a text. And he has one quote that I used in the past that I really love, where he says that every text is in mourning until it's translated. So it's the joy that is brought, and the new readers that are invited into to savor a whole world. And that's the other reason why I keep writing in Arabic, because there are so many who don't have access to English, and I don't want to lose those readers. But I want to thank all my translators from this august platform, and on this day, the day of Saddam Hussein's birthday, I want to thank. I'm being.
It's really very difficult to accept how we've been talking for 90 minutes plus, and there were no jokes. For people who don't know, Sinan is one of the funniest people on earth, in my view, and the view of so many people. And you've been pretty serious the whole time. And as you know, I'm the same way. It's very difficult for me to go for 90 minutes without messing around somehow. So this is really, I don't know if we're getting old, but I don't think so. I think we're just like trying to be good. Okay, so shukran kthir. Thank you, Sinan, infinitely
No, thank
for.
you so much, Bassam, seriously, for the invitation and for giving me this opportunity. It's very rare to have the space to look back and to think of one's writing, and to. So thank you for the questions and for the opportunity and for hosting me. I really appreciate it. I
Thank
appreciate you.
thank you to you, as somebody, so one of your ex-friends said in Baghdad. No, seriously, it's been a pleasure, and it's been so enlightening and insightful, and all the comments that I'm seeing, and including private text. I don't know why people didn't send these to social media. Everybody's really
I'm so
excited
delighted.
about this talk, and of course I am as well. Thanks for your generosity, for speaking endlessly without giving us the impression that you're becoming impatient or you need to go. So I really appreciate it. I don't know of anybody actually that has the sort of expanse that you have in terms of your intellectual production and your energy and your
Thanks.
humor and your seriously, I'm so in
Really.
awe of everything that you have produced, and I'm so fortunate to have known you also personally for close to 30 years now. So, shukran Sinan. Thanks to all of our sponsors, co-sponsors of this event. This is actually the first event where we simultaneously broadcast on all major social media platforms. So it's been a pleasure, and we're very happy that this was the event where we were able to do this with, and hopefully we will continue speak with you, Sinan, in the future, and keep it up,
Thank you so much.
whatever it is that you're doing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Habibi. Thank you.
We will talk soon. And this is the last event of this semester at the Middle East and Islamic Studies program. So we will see you sometime next year. Salam. Bye, Sinan.